Guys and girls, today we are in a very special place.
Right, you've seen this intro before, but I've come back to the Adidas archive where Adidas store more than 40,000 historical products behind lock and key. And today, I've been led back inside this climate-controlled vault to look at some of Adidas's earliest innovations. And yeah, they're old, but they're pretty cool.
Right, to be fair, I could probably spend a couple of hours just walking around picking out products to look at, but we're here to talk about the football boots. And behind me we have some of the earliest examples of innovation. Now, this might be way too early for many of us to even remember, but it just goes to show how early innovation in football boots actually started and how far they actually went back then. The earliest piece that they have in the archive is this. It's called the Fußballstiefel, basically just the football boot in English. It was made by the Dassler brothers shoe factory, which was when Adolf and Rudolf Dassler were actually working together in the football boot factory. They later split, formed two companies, but it just goes to show that even back then, you know, football boots looked way different than they do today, and it weighs a ton, and it was obviously, as you can tell, it was mostly focused on protection. Like it's not the most nimble thing in the world. Let's just put it that way. Then we move to 1954 and the Argentina, which some people called a little bit of like material cheating, because back then what the Argentina was up against was this, which is essentially as heavy as like a brick, and that's all leather. So you can imagine when you were playing in the wet, it absorbed a lot of water and it got really heavy. Now, what they were up against in the Argentina here was a football boot that kind of disrupted everything. It was slightly lower cut. It was made with thinner leather, meaning that it fit a little bit better. It wasn't as chunky. And also it had the first implementation of what we know as screw-in studs today. So not only were they able to screw in the studs in the outsole, but they actually also did it in the midsole, meaning that you had a much better functioning system that meant that you could actually adapt the studs to the playing surface that they were on back then. And it gave the players that wore this in the World Cup final for Germany what some people would call an unfair advantage. What's also funny here, what they told me, is that back then, players used to lace their boots all the way around the ankle to get a better fit. And that's actually something they accounted for by having these little flaps here that the laces could go under, even into this little lace loop at the back to give that heel lock-in. Which is, I mean, this is 1954. And there's, you know, by today's standards, it may seem pretty rudimentary, but back then, that's a huge leap for football boots. Then we move to 1966, where we have the Diamant, the Diamond, that introduced the first flex sole, basically a nylon sole here that had a thinner base here under the forefoot that allowed it to flex a lot better. That simply meant that the sole itself was less stiff. I mean, that's something we expect a football boot today to be, but it really flexed a lot better in the forefoot and helped to feel more nimble on your feet. And already then we can see that it takes the shape of that iconic Adidas silhouette that we know today. 1966, really special. And then we move on to the late 60s, early 70s, where we have these two boots called the High, basically the Shark, where Adidas actually went in and I don't think it's unfair to call these like very early, not Predator prototypes, but working with similar concepts, right? Where Adidas actually took shark skin, actual shark skin, and they put them on the boots. And that means that, you know, shark skin, it's pretty interesting, because if you rub it one way, it's pretty smooth, but when you go then against it, it almost takes off the glove here, because it's very sticky. And that meant that as you have the ball and you hit it like that, it starts to grip the ball, and as we know with SL rubber today, you would get that added grip and potentially swerve and control over the ball. So this was one of the first concepts that was worn, but they also made this, which is, I mean, it really sticks to the glove, which is really crazy, because not only does it have a big piece of shark skin on top of the boot and on the sides here, but it also introduced an asymmetrical lacing that we also know today, really cleaning up the striking surface and allowing for a grip control element on top of the boot. Again, we're talking 70s here, late 60s, early 70s, which for me to see these concepts on football boots even back then is pretty impressive. Now this is a prototype or concept, but still very, very fun to see, and actually, you know, really smooth, and I almost can't move the glove. And you could probably ask yourself, why didn't they continue with the high concept? Because it is, I mean, it's pretty damn effective when you touch it. The thing is that the shark skin was actually too effective. It gripped the ball so much that it actually destroyed what were leather balls back then. So it was a really cool concept, but you couldn't really wear it because you would just tear the balls apart. So that didn't really work. It was too good for the time. Imagine someone shooting the ball with a Predator now and just ripping it to pieces. Yeah, so it's a great idea, but wild. Then we move a little bit later into the 70s, 1973, where we have the Adidas Special here. It's just going into the era where we started having more colorful football boots. Back then, this was crazy. And I know a yellow and black football boot by today's standards, it's not particularly wild, but back then, it was, you know, people were like, are you serious? And maybe it was actually a little bit too much on the wild side for most football players back then, because they were bright and they stood out. So a really colorful era, very playful for Adidas. But what Adidas actually also did, something we see today with the women's version of the F50, is that they cooked up this. This is called the Adidas Anya, which is funny because it was named after the developer's daughter. Now what this did was to basically take a regular football boot and engineer it on a last that was a little bit slimmer to make it fit women's feet better. And they also had a stud pattern that was engineered specifically for them to think a little bit more about the rotational forces, and again, like they look at today, to avoid knee injuries and all that stuff, you know. Maybe it wasn't as scientific back then, I doubt that, but still, it's great to see how they were actually thinking of making women's specific football shoes back in the 70s. And you can probably draw a lot on the learnings and the concepts even today. Now what we also have, of course, here is the last football boot that Adolf Dassler, Adi Dassler himself, ever worked on, the World Cup. And I mean, if you're over 30 and you've played football, you probably met a World Cup football boot before, which has the iconic screw-in studs, it has the iconic look, and is really connected to the Copa Mundial that came a couple of years later in 1982. So made for the World Cup in 1978, this is the last football boot that Adolf Dassler himself ever worked on. Screw-in studs, that iconic silhouette, beautiful, beautiful. But actually, it got crazier than, I don't know if you can call it crazier, but it got just as crazy with the FE, which was actually taking the high concept and amplifying it a little bit, having this synthetic skin with little suction cups on the side. It almost feels a little bit like, you know, a table tennis bat, which we'll get back to. That was also like really, really sticky. You can almost hear it. So basically a Beckenbauer with you know, an amplified touch element on the side. Really crazy. I don't know if it ripped the balls back then, but yeah, it's fun to see. And we're still talking 70s here. But of course, they also have what I would consider one of the OGs, the Adidas Copa Mundial from 1992, which, when you look at it, yes, a couple of details have changed. Some of the logos are different from today. But actually, if you take a 2024 Copa Mundial and compare it to this, it's basically the same, which is impressive that such an old boot still has so much going for it today. So always fun to see. Naturally, Adidas also did a 25th anniversary version of the Copa Mundial. The box here is just, it's lovely, and it's just fun to see, you know, they still have it, you know, original box, leather cream, cloth, it's all there. But they also had this sitting around, which is a fun one that never saw the light of day in terms of being released to the public. But some of you might already recognize that this is actually the pattern from the Tricolor World Cup ball from 1998. But the fun thing is, and I didn't realize this from just looking at it on pictures, but it's actually the ball. The actual material from the ball that's been cut up and made into a Copa Mundial, a synthetic football Copa Mundial. And apart from looking really cool, that's just, that's wild. A football made into, but yeah, they also have that.
So yeah, Adidas have a lot of cool stuff in their archive, and this video just scratched the surface. But honestly, it was really cool to come down and see the roots of modern Adidas boots for myself. But which boot would you want to look at in the archive out of all of them? And there's a lot. Well, let me know in the comment section right down below. Remember to also watch my videos on the F50 and the Predator and the World Cup balls from the archive. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel either. And with that, I'll be signing off. Cheerio.